Ever since you were a child, you were told certain things aren't real. Ghosts, angels, demons, vampires, werewolves. The monster under your bed, the one in your closet. It's a comforting thing we've all been told all of our lives. But what do you do when you find out that the monster under the bed isn't so imaginary? What do you do when you find the devil is real? Sometimes people find these things out, and that's when they come to me. Join me, Kevin Mears, demonologist, for a look at the paranormal on my new YouTube video, Paranormal Encyclopedia. We're going to be talking about the things that go bump in the night and why sometimes there really are such things. Good evening and welcome to another episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am your host, Kevin Mears. Sorry it's been kind of up and down lately. We've had a little technical issues on our end, but we should be back under control and on our way. So tonight we're going to be talking about a big popular issue, one that's kind of important to me because it's where I got my start in my interest in the paranormal. We're talking about vampires. Yep, the undead, Nosferatu. The dead guys, the non-sparkly kind. Yeah? Okay. So, werewolves, which is another topic we're going to be talking about soon with my friend Drew, who was my first interview, as you guys hopefully remember, is our kind of related subject. They're both ideas you find all over the place. Really, what I would consider a vampire you're getting out of Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, the Romani. There are similar creatures all over the world, certainly. Certainly, for example, there are some fey creatures in England and Ireland that are very similar to vampires. But really, it's Eastern Europe is the core of what we're talking about here. The legends probably came out of Greece and Italy, where you find the most similar creatures. But okay, so before we get into Anne Rice and Stephanie Meyer, let's talk about what we mean by a vampire. The word vampire comes from Hungary. Originally the term is vampire. It most technically translates to mean blood drinker. The German word that's very popular thanks to the movie, of course, is Nosferatu, which it means walking plague. Interestingly enough, Nosferatu actually just meant a plague carrier, not a vampire. It got adapted later. Now, the movie didn't create the link. It's older than that, but it wasn't originally meant to be a vampire in the sense that we think. So, okay, that's some etymology for you. Let's talk about vampires. Specifically, vampires are dead people that get up out of the grave and attack the living. Or dead people that feed on the living, I should say. Most classically, they get out of the grave, they attack people, they drink their blood. Not always. There's Hungarian legends of a creature that actually just sits in its grave and chews on its funeral shroud, which causes its relatives to waste away and die. That's one of the things you'll find out is most historical vampire legends, it's not a hundreds of years old count that's doing everything. It's your father, your mother, your somebody you knew, usually an immediate family member, who's feasting on your blood. There are some exceptions to that, certainly, but those are the most common stories. Now let's talk as well. Again, before I get into the other thing I was about to, we're talking about usually dead bodies that get out and attack people. There are some implications in some of the legends, certainly that you're actually dealing with spirits, a spirit of the dead person. And I'm going to get into that more when I talk about, okay, what are vampires really? Do they exist and all that? But right now we're talking about folklore. Some of the big things to realize that separate folkloric vampires from what you think vampires are. For a start, in folklore, vampires are walking corpses. They look like corpses. They smell like corpses. They're dressed in funeral shrouds, funeral clothes. They aren't suave, happy, debonair New Orleans guys with fancy accents and all of that. Most of the things we think are kill vampires are actually wrong or misunderstandings. The most common thing is, of course, sunlight. Everybody knows sunlight kills vampires. Yeah, there's the thing. It doesn't appear anywhere in the folklore. Even if you read Bram Stoker's Dracula, and we're going to be talking about that more in a bit, sunlight didn't kill Dracula. Dracula actually comes out during the day. That was invented by the movie Nosferatu. So the story of the movie Nosferatu, they wanted to make a movie based on the book Dracula. Problem is, you want to make a movie based on a book, you have to pay royalties. Now, Bram Stoker was dead by the point they made this movie, but his widow was still alive. Under the law, they had to pay royalty to the widow. So the guys making the movie didn't want to do that. They said, okay, we're going to make some changes and get out of it. That's why they called it Nosferatu. They thought incorrectly, but they thought that the Stoker estate had claim over the word vampire. They named the vampire Orlok instead of Dracula. And the big change they made is, well, how are we going to kill him? And that's where this idea of sunlight comes in. Again, not anywhere in the folklore. In the folklore, certainly when a vampire is exposed to sunlight, it usually goes back to its grave. They sleep during the day. They don't die. They don't burst into flames. None of that. Even if you broaden your definition to the other various vampire-like creatures around the world, sunlight's not fatal. Now, stakes through the heart is an actual part of folklore. But how staking a vampire through the heart works is a little different than you see in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You're actually not just sticking a piece of wood through their heart and then you're done for the day. You're driving a piece of wood through their body, through the coffin, and into the ground. You're actually physically impaling them to the ground. There's some argument you can make in terms of the folklore. Did that actually kill it? Or can it not simply get up again? And there's some symbolic nature in terms of binding it to the earth. A lot of the other methods were very preventative, more like you cut off its head and you put the head between its legs and rebury it. It can't get its head and put it back on, so it can't go attacking people. You bury it upside down so that when it tries to dig its way out of a coffin, instead of digging towards the surface, it starts digging deeper into the earth. There's a lot of other similar. There's like putting roses and things like on the grave to stop it from getting out. A lot of the times it's very preventative measures. The most common way, if you really want to get rid of the vampire for good, you burn it. You put it on a funeral pile, you burn it to ash, you're done. That was usually considered the most reliable way to finish the job. And yes, there was actual records, and you can look online, you can find that people like Arnold Pale is a very famous one, who was a Serbian soldier who was supposedly infected by a vampire in Greece, and then he came home, started making attacks on people. He died. He didn't die like a mysterious blood loss or anything. He died in a fall. But after he died, people started to become ill. People started to die. People claimed to see him. They dug up his body. His body didn't look like it had decayed the way it should. And they ultimately burned the body and moved on. And then the attacks began again in the same area. The Pale case is very interesting because it's actually a very well documented case of alleged vampirism. There's plenty of information on it online. You can also look up, there's a woman by the name of Mercy Brown, which is a little more recent. What's very interesting about Brown is that was here in the United States, in Rhode Island. So again, people got ill. She was the first one to die. Other people start wasting away. People claim to see her. People dig up and burn the body. But again, this is your common thing. If you want to get rid of the vampire, dig it up, burn the body. It was considered more reliable than the stakes and everything else. Because sometimes there's The one story of a vampire who was dug up. They drove a stake through his heart, and he said that he stood up. He pulled the stake out and goes, "Thank you. Now I have a stick to drive the dogs away with." And he's banging on the doors. So those are your major ways to kill vampires. Let's talk a little bit. How do you become a vampire? Now, most people think, well, you get bitten on the neck and you become a vampire, or you drink its blood and you become a vampire. That's common enough in the folklore. It's certainly not something. The werewolves and being bitten was made up by Hollywood. They borrowed half of the stuff you think you know about about werewolf legends. They just borrowed from vampire legends. And we'll talk about that more when we do the werewolf video. Vampires, you can be bitten and become a vampire. A lot of the times, though, it was something you did that made you cursed, so that you become a vampire when you die. Excommunication from the church, being a murderer, committing suicide, all were supposed to turn you into a vampire after you die. There are some other ways that you couldn't necessarily control: being born with red hair, being born with teeth, being born with hair, being born on Christmas Day, being the seventh son of a seventh son, which is, of course, interesting because it's more well known. In some legends, being the seventh son of a seventh son is very lucky. In other legends, it makes you a vampire, being born on Saturdays. Having a black cat jump over your grave after you've passed. On and on and on and on. The thing is, there's a lot of vampire legends all over the world, and especially all over Eastern Europe. So it's hard to go, well, this is the one way you become a vampire. There's too many different variations on it. Now, before I get a little into the pop culture of vampires, I want to talk about what vampires may actually be. Do they exist? So, do vampires actually exist? I don't know. I really don't. I've never encountered a vampire. I don't know any first-hand sources that have encountered a vampire. At least that I believe. Back when I did the radio show, we had a guy named Bishop Seton Manchester who claimed to be a vampire hunter. I'm skeptical. I'll just leave it at that. But I think there's probably some origin to what people are describing. The two ways I would argue this may happen. One, and the more common, would be certain types of spirits. Certainly, there are predatory spirits. Demons, in particular, like to feed on emotional energy. They gain power from hate and fear and suffering and things of that nature. There's certainly some evidence they can feed on people. There's debatable accounts that living people may also be able to take emotional energy from each other. Again, skeptical, although maybe. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. The other way that the actual classical dead body getting out of the ground, I would argue if that happens, and I'm not decisively saying it does or it doesn't, what you're looking at it isn't the person gets up and digs themselves out of the grave and goes about their business. A demon's possessing the body. This is fairly consistent with the folklore. The thing to realize is vampires aren't really what you think about from pop culture. And I'm getting there, trust me. In this video, we're not going to have to wait for the next video to hear about it. But they're not nice, they're not suave, they're not debonair, they're not somebody you're going to have a conversation with. They get out of the ground and they attack people. And then they go back into the ground. That's a vampire. Not Lestat, not, for heaven's sakes, Edward. You're not going to have a sweet conversation with them. Now, granted, in some folklore, particularly Romani and Romanian folklore and some of the Baltic legends, vampires do visit their wives and have children. There's an idea, some of you who know Blade, the comic book character, or Vampire Hunter D, may know, called the Dhampir. A Dhampir is the child of a human and a vampire. They're really interesting in that there are actual historical accounts of these people that would travel around Eastern Europe and claim to be Dhampirs. Now, according to the folk beliefs in the areas they were working in, vampires were normally invisible. You can't see one. But a Dhampir, being half vampire, could see it. So the Dhampir would come into a town, claim the town is having a problem with a vampire. And then in return for money, he would pick a fight with this invisible being. He'd shoot it, he'd stab it, some blood would appear, he'd say the vampire was dead, and he'd get his money. In reality, you're probably dealing with con men using magic tricks. It's not that hard to make fake blood, especially when you're fighting something no one else can see. But that's kind of where that sits. It's sort of an interesting take on the whole thing. I think it's possible, maybe under certain circumstances, and certainly there's some evidence I've seen from reliable sources that zombies may on occasion be dead bodies that are possessed. And I'll talk more about that situation when I talk about zombies, which is another upcoming thing. With the Halloween month, I kind of want to do monsters, because I think it's a good theme. Like I said, I've never seen this happen. I think likely for one reason or another, if it happened once, it's not as common today. I don't know why. But there you go. Let's talk a little about pop culture. First of all, I'm going to tell one of my favorite stories, actually. I'm a history buff, though that isn't going to come through as much in these videos, just because it doesn't always relate to the paranormal. But I'm going to tell a story about the first vampire novel. Now, there were English books about vampires before, about vampires before this, written by a priest that was actually relating the legends of vampires from 18th century. But the first fictional account is called The Vampire, and that's Vampyre. This was written by a man by the name of John Polidori. The story of how Polidori wrote the book is, to me, extremely funny. So in 1816, you had what's called the year without a summer. What happened? Well, the year before, Mount Krakatoa and several other big volcanoes around the world erupted. This sent the world's environment into a tizzy. It screwed up weather patterns all over the planet. It caused storms, it caused rain. The middle of July was much colder and wetter than normal, even the middle of Europe. Now, a group of 4 friends had decided to get together this year without a summer at Lake Geneva, specifically at the one friend's mansion. The plan was to do some picnicking and do some boating and some hiking, some various outdoorsy activities. Now, it's raining all the bloody time. They can't do this. They're stuck inside. They're sitting in the library one night, and the owner of the house is reading a book called Phantasmagoria. Phantasmagoria was a popular French collection of ghost stories at the time. But he didn't like the stories. He thought they could do better. So the friends came up with a little challenge. They're going to write their own ghost stories. Now, the host was a man by the name of George Gordon Byron, Lord Byron. Lord Byron started what's become known as Fragment of a Novel. He got word and finished it. It was a story about a vampire. His personal physician, John Polidori, picked up that fragment and finished the story. Now, the vampire, Lord Retuvin, is shamelessly based on Byron. And to Byron's credit, when the book first came out, when it was first published, the author's name wasn't known. A lot of people thought, because the vampire was very clearly Byron, and Byron had used a lot of vampiric imagery in his poetry, he wrote the book. And no, Byron actually gave Polidori credit. Now, of the other members, one was another very famous and very prominent poet who also used a lot of vampire imagery. That would be Percy Shelley. Now, Shelley, if he ever wrote anything, I don't know what it was. I've never actually found it. But his girlfriend at the time has this idea. Now, the two of them had done some traveling in Europe, particularly in Germany, that heard some local legends of a certain baron. She in turn had had some nightmares. It's a common recurring theme in Gothic literature that they got the idea from a nightmare. And she starts a story. The story is, of course, Frankenstein. We're talking about Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. I find this story so amusing for a couple of reasons. One, Mary was an unknown. She only wrote one more book, which is called The Last Man, which is an end-of-the-world type of novel. She wasn't a well-known writer. Her mother was. Mary Wollstonecraft herself was a very well-known folklorist of the day. Or not actually a folklorist. She was one of the first feminists. Her boyfriend was a very established romantic poet, very well-respected. Lord Byron is, of course, very well-respected. But Byron and Percy Shelley didn't produce anything. On the other hand, two complete unknowns, John Polidori and Mary Shelley, produced two very important books. I mean, Mary certainly didn't invent the Gothic genre, but she's one of the most important writers in the Gothic genre, not to mention just about invented the science fiction genre with the novel Frankenstein. And John Polidori was a very important influence on vampire fiction. The romantic, debonair, suave, likable vampire really starts with Lord Vertuven from The Vampire. Now, you get some more fiction in there. You get a book called Camilla by Fanu, which was this, very much deals with a lot of the social issues of the day, in that it's an Eastern European noble coming to Europe and starting a relationship with a Western woman, and some implications of a sexual relationship, which is interesting because they're both women, which makes this, it's not an overt, but there's certainly some implications of an early reference to lesbianism in the 1800s. And ultimately, a very Van Helsing-like figure comes along and kills the vampire. There's, of course, the giant serial novel Varney the Vampire, which is very important. But let's skip ahead a little and talk to the granddaddy of vampire folklore, Dracula. Bram Stoker was a manager for an important playhouse in London. And he actually started his story as a very long play. I think, if memory serves, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 acts. He wrote it very much So Bram Stoker was specifically the manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London, and he worked specifically for Henry Irving, a very important actor at the time. In fact, he originally wrote the part of Dracula with Irving in mind. What's interesting is that Stoker didn't originally name the book Dracula. He named it The Undead, and the character was Count Wampire. He came across the name Dracula in a book of Romanian history, and it just caught his mind, and he renamed the book. And he changed a few of the details. Now, the historical Vlad Tepes is a really cool and interesting subject that we're going to do a whole other video about. I hate to do a spoiler type of thing like this, but he's really worth the video in his own right. The historical Dracula is a really fascinating figure in his history. Suffice to say, the book Dracula set the tone. It set up the popularity of the vampire genre more than any of the books before it. If you haven't read it, go read this book. It is a masterpiece of the Gothic genre. I can't say enough nice things about it. Of course, his book turned into a ton of movies. Dracula is one of, if not the most popular fictional characters in history. There's books, there's movies, there's plays, there's ballets, there's musicals, there's American Sign Language productions. There's everything you can think of. and it spawned the modern vampire genre as we think. There's a bunch of other writers we could talk about, but because I don't want to go on forever as much as I could, because vampires are a favorite of mine, as I've said, let's talk about the two that have created the vampire as we think of them today. Anne Rice and Stephenie Meyer. I don't like Anne Rice. I've never liked Anne Rice. I don't think I don't like her as a writer. And the thing to realize about Rice, even if you like her, she is not a source on vampire folklore. Bram Stoker, when he wrote his novel, did a lot of research on Eastern European folklore and history. Anne Rice didn't care. She's said more than once she has no interest in the folklore. She was interested in vampires as a symbolic imagery as she saw it. So and I'm going to get to the vampire subculture in a minute, but all these people that are saying, oh, I'm a vampire, based on her books, you need to go pick up a book on folklore. You don't know what you're talking about. But she certainly well, she didn't invent the romantic vampire, as I just said. John Polidori really set the stage for the romantic sexual vampire. And also more contemporarily, Bela Lugosi. And when I get to Dracula specifically, I'll talk more about Lugosi. To his dying day, got fan mail from women talking about how attracted to him as Dracula they were. So Anne Rice does not deserve credit for creating the sexy vampire concept. She popularized it. That's it. Now along comes Stephenie Meyer. And who I don't like Anne Rice. I loathe Stephenie Meyer. If I ever invent a time machine, going back in time and stopping Stephenie Meyer from writing Twilight is high on my to-do list, as is actually stopping Anne Rice from writing the Vampire Chronicles. Because without one, you wouldn't have the other. Vampires don't sparkle. No. They're bad fiction. They have they are not based on folklore. The less said about Twilight, the better. There are so many better vampire books out there. It's not even funny. Read Dracula, read The Vampire, read Varney the Vampire, read The Dresden Files. Go watch Count Von Count on Sesame Street. Don't waste your time on Twilight. Please. But yeah, that gives you an idea of the progression of the idea. I could keep going. Vampires are a very large subject, but I want to talk very, very briefly about the vampire subculture. So there's a group of people out there related to, and this is important to realize, people tend to think, oh, goths think they're vampires. No, they don't. I don't want to spoil anything yet because I'm still working on details. We're going to have a guest on, then we can talk about what goth means. And he knows it much better than I do. But there's the vampire subculture that actually think they're vampires, or at least incorporate that vampire motif. And there's goth subculture. They're certainly related, but they're not the same thing. So don't get them confused. Most of these people have read too much Anne Rice. They're not vampires. They're people. They might drink blood. Some of them do. Some of them don't. But okay. And rule of thumb, folks: if you think you're a vampire, if you think your friend's a vampire, check your pulse. If you've got a pulse, you're not a vampire. Vampires are dead bodies or spirits of the dead that attack the living. They are not living people that drink blood as a sexual fetish, or because they think it's interesting, or they think it's daring. That doesn't make you a vampire. If you want to imagine and play pretend and play, there's role-playing games like Vampire the Masquerade and Vampire the Requiem, but those people aren't pretending to be, they're not claiming they're actually vampires. They're playing pretend as vampires. And I'm a role player myself. I am not bad-mouthing either game by saying that. Just realize those people aren't claiming to be vampires. It's a game. There are actually people who think they're vampires, and those people are fooling themselves. Now, I'm not saying they don't have a right to do that. If you're not going out and hurting anybody for their blood, I don't care what you do. But I and other actual folklorists are chuckling at you because you have no claim to the title, and you probably need to go pick up a book on actual Romanian folklore. Stop reading Anne Rice as your source of what vampires are. Even people I know that think there are actual vampires, like that, dead body, corpses or living people that absolutely depend on blood, usually read too much Anne Rice. Anne Rice is not a source on folklore. Vampires are not sexy. Vampires are not suave. They're not debonair. They're not well spoken. They are corpses that get out of the ground and attack people for their blood. Think less Lestat, more Night of the Living Dead. That's a whole other thing in and of it. Zombies are a whole other thing in and of itself. But George Romero's zombies have a lot more in common with folkloric vampires than anything Anne Rice has ever written. Okay, that wraps us up for vampires. I hope you guys are enjoying these. Again, I do apologize. There's been a bit of a hiatus. We're back on track with that, though. We should have a couple of videos up this week. If you like what I'm doing, please subscribe. Please hit like, share comments, share questions. Feel free to go to our website. There's a link below. Please support us with Patreon. We could really use the support here. We've got a line on what should be a really excellent camera, but that's still a little bit of ways. And some of the really exciting news I can't quite announce yet is depending on getting the camera. But even if you don't have the money, and believe me, I understand, I've been there, share the links. Get the word out there. And do me a personal favor as well. If you have ad blocker set off while you watch my videos, please turn it off. I know the ads are a pain in the neck, but I do get ad revenue. I'm not making that much money here, folks. Even a little bit from the ad revenue is doing me a favor. So if you could turn off ad blocker, I'd really appreciate it. But that's it for now. Have a good night.